A Miss Marple story. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where gossip flows as freely as tea, Miss Jane Marple knits quietly, her sharp eyes missing nothing, when chilling tales of a shadow with cold hands gripping villagers in the night spark fear and death. Only Miss Marple's keen mind can unravel the truth behind the terror. In this original tale, set in the heart of Agatha Christie's world, expect deception, village secrets, and a twist that will leave you stunned. Chapter 1. The tranquil village awakens. The morning sun crept over the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow on the thatched roofs and tidy gardens that defined the village's charm. It was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did, and where the rhythm of life seemed as predictable as the ticking of the church clock. Roses bloomed in neat beds, sparrows chattered in the hedgerows, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted from Mrs. Price's bakery. To an outsider, it was idyllic. To Miss Jane Marple, who sat in her armchair by the window of her cottage on High Street, it was a tapestry of human nature, woven with threads of kindness, envy, and secrets. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl, her fingers nimble despite her years, her eyes bright and bird-like, darted occasionally to the street outside, where life unfolded in its quiet, predictable way. Mrs. Bantry, her friend and neighbour, had just passed by, her straw hat bobbing, as she chatted with young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy. Across the lane, Mr. Clement, the vicar, was fussing with the church notice board, muttering about the damp ruining his posters for the upcoming fete. It was all so familiar, so comforting. Yet Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that tranquility often masked turbulence, felt a prickle of curiosity. Something was stirring. In St. Mary Mead, she could sense it, like a faint draught in a closed room. Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of her maid, Cherry Baker, a cheerful young woman whose modern ideas about housework sometimes clashed with Miss Marple's old-fashioned preferences. Cherry bustled in, balancing a tray of tea and scones, her auburn curls bouncing. "Morning, Miss Marple," Cherry said brightly, setting the tray on the table. "You'll never guess what I heard at the post office just now. Old Mrs. Finch, she's the one who lives by the old mill, you know, says she felt something peculiar last night. Woke up in a fright, she did. Swearing something cold touched her in the dark. Hands, she said, like ice, gave me the shivers just hearing it." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment, though her expression remained serene. "Cold hands, you say?" she murmured, pouring tea with steady hands. "How curious. Did Mrs. Finch see anything?" "Not a thing," Cherry replied. Her eyes wide, said it was pitch black, and when she lit her candle, there was nothing but her own shadow on the wall. "Reckon she's just getting fanciful in her old age," but she was proper shaken. "Mr. Pye at the post office thinks it's the damp air playing tricks. Mind you, he's always got an opinion." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mr. Pye does enjoy his theories, but Mrs. Finch is not one for flights of fancy. Is she? A sensible woman, if a little prone to rheumatism." Cherry laughed. It's what I said. But you know how it is here. Give it a day, and half the village set'll be talking about ghosts or goblins. Oh, and speaking of talk, Mrs. Bantry sits hosting tea tomorrow. She sits invited half the parish, I hear. You going? "I expect so," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her mind already turning over Cherry's tale. A cold touch in the night, unseen, unexplained. It was the sort of story that could ripple through St. Mary Mead like a stone tossed into a pond, stirring up all manner of speculation. And speculation, as Miss Marple well knew, often hid truth in its folds. As Cherry prattled on about the village fete and the vicar's latest sermon, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to Mrs. Finch. The old mill was a lonely place, set apart from the village proper, surrounded by willows that whispered in the wind. A cold touch could be many things, a draught, a dream, or something else entirely. She recalled a similar tale from her youth, when a cousin in Devon had sworn a ghostly hand had brushed her cheek, only for it to be revealed as a prank by a mischievous nephew. But Mrs. Finch was not one to be pranked, nor to imagine such things without cause. The clock on the mantel chimed 11, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Cherry," she said, "do be a dear, and fetch my shawl. I think a walk to the post office might do me good. Fresh air, you know." Cherry grinned. "Hoping to hear more about Mrs. Finch Sipt's ghost, are you? I sipt'll grab it." As Cherry disappeared into the hall, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the window. The village looked as peaceful as ever, but she knew better than most that peace was fragile. Something had touched Mrs. Finch in the night. And whether it was a trick of the mind or something more sinister, Miss Marple intended to find out. After all, as she often remarked to her nephew Raymond, human nature was much the same everywhere, whether in London or St. Mary Mead, and it was rarely as innocent as it seemed. What's next? Oh dear reader, the mystery of the shadow with cold hands is just beginning to unfold. What do you think touched Mrs. Finch in the dark? A ghostly presence, a prank, or something far more cunning? Drop a comment below with your location. Where in the world are you joining Miss Marple's adventure from? And subscribe to the channel to follow every chilling twist and turn. Don't miss Chapter 2, where the village's whispers grow louder. Chapter 2. The First Chill. The mist hung low over St. Mary Mead that evening, curling around the lamp-posts like ghostly fingers and muffling the usual chatter of the village. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves from the woods beyond the old mill. Most of the villagers had retreated to their hearths, but at the Blue Boar, the local pub, a small crowd lingered, their voices hushed over pints of ale. The tale of Mrs. Finch's encounter had spread like wildfire, and though some dismissed it as the ramblings of an old widow, others felt a shiver that had little to do with the autumn chill. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not at the Blue Boar. She sat in her drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened to the patter of rain against the window. The fire cast a warm glow, but her thoughts were elsewhere, turning over Cherry's account of Mrs. Finch's fright. She had visited the post office that morning as planned and found the village abuzz. Mr. Pye, the postmaster, had been particularly vocal, insisting it was all nonsense about ghosts, while Mrs. Hay, the grocer's wife, had whispered of curses tied to the old mill. Miss Marple had said little, only nodding and smiling, but her mind catalogued every detail. Her reverie was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Cherry, who had been polishing silver in the kitchen, hurried to answer it. Moments later, she ushered in a flushed and breathless Mrs. Bantry, her coat dripping from the rain. "Jane, you'll never believe it," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, shaking water from her hat. "It's happened again. Young Peter Grimsby, the lad who helps at the bakery, swears he felt something last night, cold hands, just like Mrs. Finch. I heard it from his mother at the church hall. The poor boy's terrified, and half the village is in a tizzy." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression calm. but her eyes keen. "Cold hands, you say? How very interesting. Do sit down, Dolly, and tell me everything." Mrs. Bantry needed no further prompting. She sank into the armchair, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was just after midnight. Apparently, Peter was walking home from the Blue Boar. He'd been helping clear up after closing. You know how he earns a bit extra there. He took the shortcut through the lane by the churchyard, and he says it was as if the fog itself grabbed him. Cold, clammy hands on his neck. He swears it. He ran all the way home, screaming fit to wake the dead. His mother says he's still pale as a sheet. "Most curious," Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea from the pot Cherry had brought in. "And did Peter see anything? A figure, perhaps?" "Not a thing," Mrs. Bantry said, "excepting the cup, just like Mrs. Finch. He said the fog was so thick he could barely see his own feet, and then, wham, this icy grip. By the time he turned around, there was nothing but mist. Of course you know how boys are. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd had one too many at the pub, but his mother insists he's not the sort to make it up." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Peter Grimsby is a steady lad, I believe, not prone to exaggeration, though perhaps a touch impressionable. And this happened by the churchyard, you say?" "Yes, that gloomy old lane," Mrs. Bantry said with a shudder. "I never liked it myself. All those crooked headstones and that creaky gate. No wonder people are talking about ghosts. But honestly, Jane, what do you make of it? Two people, both touched by these cold hands, and no one sees a thing." "It is certainly peculiar," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her mind racing. "One might think of a draught, or perhaps a trick of the nerves, but twice in 2 days suggests something more. I wonder if there sits a pattern." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "You think there sits something to it, don't sit you? Oh, Jane, you sit always so clever about these things. Remember that business with the missing silver at the vicarage? Everyone thought it was gypsies, but you figured out it was the curate's nephew." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People are often less mysterious than they seem, Dolly. But this does intrigue me. Tell me, what are they saying at the church hall? Any theories?" Mrs. Bantry snorted. "Oh, the usual nonsense. Mrs. Hayes convinced it's the ghost of old Josiah Black, the miller who drowned himself 50 years ago. Mr. Pye says it's just the weather. Bad air, he calls it. And then there's Miss Cram, the dressmaker, who's been reading those dreadful penny novels. She thinks it's some sort of vampire. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Miss Cram does have a vivid imagination, but I suspect the truth is rather less fantastical. Still, 2 incidents so close together, I should like to speak to Peter myself, if his mother permits, and perhaps Mrs. Finch too." "You still get to the bottom of it." "I am sure," Mrs. Bantry said, rising. "I must dash Arthur 6, expecting me for supper, and he gets cross if I 6'm late. But do come to tea tomorrow, Jane. Everyone will be there, and I dare say the talk will be all about this shadow business." "I wouldn't miss it," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "And do take care in the fog, Dolly. One never knows what might be lurking." Mrs. Bantry laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it as she pulled on her coat and stepped back into the misty night. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her thoughts were far from the pale blue shawl. 2 people, touched by cold hands in the dark, one near the old mill, the other by the churchyard, both isolated spots, both shrouded in fog. It could be coincidence, Or it could be something more deliberate. She thought of her nephew Raymond's stories of London pickpockets, who used crowds to mask their movements. Could someone be using the fog in much the same way? As the fire crackled and the rain tapped against the panes, Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. She would attend Mrs. Bantry's tea, she decided, and listen closely to the village gossip. For if there was one thing she knew about St. Mary Mead, it was that the truth often hid in the chatter of its residents, like a pearl in an oyster, waiting for a sharp eye to pry it free. Chapter 3. Gossip over Tea. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall was a warm haven against the damp chill of St. Mary Mead's autumn afternoon. Mrs. Bantry had outdone herself, as usual, with a spread of delicate sandwiches, scones with clotted cream, and a Victoria sponge that gleamed under the chandelier. The room buzzed with the chatter of a dozen villagers, their voices rising and falling like a flock of starlings. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner near the fireplace, her knitting in her lap, her mild expression giving no hint of the keen attention she paid to every word. Mrs. Bantry flitted about, playing the gracious hostess, though her eyes sparkled with the thrill of the village's latest scandal. The shadow with cold hands had become the talk of St. Mary Mead, and the tea party was its epicentre. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze drifting from one guest to another. Mrs. Hay, the grocer's wife, gesticulating wildly. Mr. Clement, the vicar, looking faintly uncomfortable. Miss Crane, the dressmaker, clutching a lurid novel. And young Dr. Hayward, the new physician, who seemed more amused than alarmed by the gossip. "It's positively uncanny," Mrs. Hay was saying, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. "First Mrs. Finch, now poor Peter Grimsby. I tell you it's that old Miller, Josiah Black, come back to haunt us. My grandmother always said he cursed this village when he drowned." "Nonsense, Mrs. Hay," Mr. Pye interjected, adjusting his spectacles. The postmaster Pole's tone was as sharp as his pencil. "There stem's no such thing as ghosts.
Item's the fog.
I tell you, bad air miasma, call it what you will, plays tricks on the nerves. I read about it in a medical journal." Miss Cram, her cheeks flushed, leaned forward. "It's not miasma, Mr. Pye. I read in The Phantom's Curse about a creature that creeps in the dark, cold as death. It's a vampire, mark my words." She clutched her novel tighter, as if it might protect her. Dr. Hayward chuckled, brushing crumbs from his tweed jacket. "Vampires, Miss Cram. I'm afraid my medical training leans toward more mundane explanations. A chill in the night, perhaps, or an overactive imagination. Young Peter was likely tipsy, and Mrs. Finch, well, she's not as young as she used to be." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her eyes resting briefly on Dr. Hayward. He was new to St. Mary Mead, having taken over Dr. Lloyd's practice only a month ago. Charming, confident, and quick to dismiss the village's fears, she made a mental note of his tone, which carried just a hint of condescension. Mrs. Bantry, sweeping by with a teapot, paused to join the conversation. "Oh, come now, doctor. You can sit, deny it. Such strange. Two people, both touched by cold hands, and neither saw a thing. I sit been not saying it sits ghosts, but it sits enough to make one lock the doors at night." "Quite right," said Mr. Clement, his voice gentle but strained. "Though I do wish we could avoid talk of curses. It's unsettling for the parish. I had 3 people ask me to bless their homes this week alone." Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. "It is curious, isn't it? 2 incidents, both in lonely places, both at night. I wonder if Mrs. Finch and Peter Grimsby have anything in common. Did they perhaps know each other well? The room fell quiet for a moment, as if her question had caught them off guard. Mrs. Hay frowned. Well, I suppose they both go to church, but who doesn't sit? Mrs. Finch keeps to herself, and Peter sits always running about, bakery, pub, odd jobs. I can think of any connection. Nor I, said Mr. Pye, though his tone suggested he found the question irrelevant. It sounds all coincidence, Miss Marple. Yourselves looking for patterns where there are none. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Perhaps, Mr. Pye, but I find patterns have a way of revealing themselves. If one looks closely enough, like a dropped stitch in knitting, it seems small, but it can unravel the whole piece. Dr. Hayward raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. You sound as if you suspect something more than fog or ghosts, Miss Marple. Care to share your theory? Oh, I have no theories, she said lightly, her needles resuming their rhythm. I'm only an old woman who likes to listen. But I do think it might be worth asking Peter and Mrs. Finch for more details. People often notice more than they realize. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. There you go, Jane. Sleuthing already. I told you she should have ideas. Didn't, sit I. Now, who sits for more sponge cake? The conversation shifted to lighter topics, the upcoming fit, the vicar's new hymnals, but Miss Marple's mind remained on the shadow. She noted how Mr. Pye's dismissal seemed a touch too forceful, as if he were convincing himself as much as others. Miss Cram's talk of vampires was absurd, of course, but her fear was genuine, and fear could make people careless with their words. Or Dr. Hayward's amusement struck her as odd for a doctor who ought to be more curious about unexplained phenomena. And Mr. Clement, poor man, looked as if he hadn't slept in days. As the tea party wound down, Miss Marple slipped out quietly, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The fog had lifted, leaving the air crisp and the sky a pale grey. She walked slowly toward the village green, her thoughts turning to the churchyard lane, where Peter Grimsby had felt those cold hands. It was a narrow path, flanked by ancient yews and weathered graves, not a place one lingered after dark. She recalled a story her gardener, old Tom, had once told about a poacher who used the churchyard to hide stolen game, slipping through the fog to avoid detection. Could someone be using the fog now, for a different purpose? She paused by the church gate, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. The lane was muddy from the rain, and she noted a few indistinct footprints, though nothing clear enough to be useful. Still, she filed the observation away, like a scrap of yarn saved for later. As she turned toward home, she saw Peter Grimsby himself, trudging along with a sack of flour slung over his shoulder. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously. "Good afternoon, Peter," she called, her voice kind but firm. "I hear you had quite a fright last night." The boy started, nearly dropping his sack. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't like to talk about it. Makes my skin crawl." "Of course," she said gently, "but if you ever feel like chatting, I stupple always at home with a cup of tea. Sometimes talking helps one remember the little things." Peter nodded, mumbling something about work, and hurried off. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind turning over his skittishness. Fear, she knew, could hide as much as it revealed, and in St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as daisies, she suspected there was more to this shadow than met the eye. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Fog. The fog had returned to St. Mary Mead with a vengeance, wrapping the village in a thick grey shroud that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. By dusk, the streets were all but deserted, the glow of cottage windows reduced to faint smudges in the gloom. The villagers, usually so fond of their evening strolls, had taken to locking their doors early, their imaginations stirred by the growing legend of the shadow with cold hands. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not one to be deterred by fog or fear. She sat by her window, her knitting a soft rhythm against the silence, her eyes occasionally lifting to the misty lane outside. The village was holding its breath, she thought, and she intended to find out why. The day had been abuzz with talk of Peter Grimsby's encounter, and Miss Marple had spent the morning at the village shop, listening as Mrs. Hay recounted the boy's tale to every customer who passed through. The details were consistent: a cold, clammy grip in the churchyard lane, no figure seen, only the oppressive weight of the fog. Miss Marple had nodded sympathetically, asking gentle questions that seemed to go nowhere but lodged in her mind like seeds. She had also visited Mrs. Finch at the old mill, finding the widow pale but resolute, insisting she'd felt something real, not a dream. The consistency of the stories intrigued Miss Marple, as did their differences. Mrs. Finch had been in her bedroom, Peter in the open air. Was it the same phenomenon, or something cleverly staged? Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion outside, a sharp cry cutting through the fog. She set her knitting aside and moved to the door, her shawl draped over her shoulders. Cherry, who had been reading a magazine in the kitchen, appeared at her side, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that, Miss Marple?" Cherry whispered. "Sounded like it came from the green." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "Fetch my coat, Cherry, and we still see what said's amiss." By the time they stepped outside, the cry had faded, replaced by the muffled sound of footsteps and voices. The fog was so dense that Miss Marple could scarcely see the lamppost across the lane, but she followed the sounds toward the village green, Cherry clutching her arm. As they neared, shapes emerged from the mist. Mr. Pye, his spectacles fogged, Mrs. Bantry, clutching a lantern, and Dr. Hayward, his medical bag in hand. At the centre of the group stood Miss Lavinia Price, the baker's sister, trembling and wrapped in a shawl. Her face was ashen, her eyes darting, as if expecting something to leap from the fog. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but carrying authority. Mrs. Bantry turned, her lantern casting eerie shadows. "It's Lavinia. She says she was grabbed, Jane, right here on the green. Cold hands, just like the others. I was just coming back from the vicarage when I heard her scream." Miss Marple's sister's eyes flickered to Miss Price, who was being steadied by Dr. Hayward. "Miss Price, my dear," she said softly, "can you tell us what happened? Take your time." Miss Price's voice quavered, but she managed to speak. "I was walking home from the shop. Tommy had kept me late, you know, with the accounts. It was so foggy, I could hardly see, but I know the green like the back of my hand. Then, out of nowhere, I felt it, hands cold as ice, grabbing my wrists. I screamed and pulled away, and then, nothing, just the fog. I swear I heard footsteps running, but I couldn't see a soul." Dr. Hayward patted her shoulder, his voice soothing but tinged with skepticism. There, Miss Price. You've had a shock, that's all. The fog can play tricks, and with all this talk of shadows, it's no wonder you're jumpy. Let's get you inside, and I'll give you something to calm your nerves. Let's get you inside, and I'll give you something to calm your nerves. Miss Price shook her head vehemently. It wasn't sit my nerves, Doctor. I felt those hands, real as anything. I sit not imagining it. Of course not, Miss Marple said, her voice so kind it seemed to steady Miss Price. You stir a sensible woman, Lavinia. Did you notice anything else? A smell, perhaps, or a sound, before the hands touched you? Miss Price frowned, thinking, well, there was a sort of rustle, like leaves or cloth, just before it happened. And maybe, yes, a faint smell, like damp wool or earth. But it was so quick, and the fog was so thick. Miss Marple nodded, filing the details away. Thank you, my dear. That sits very helpful. Mr. Pye snorted, wiping his spectacles. Helpful? It sets mass hysteria. That sits what it is. First Mrs. Finch, then that boy Peter, now Miss Price. Next we sit'll have the whole village seeing ghosts. It sits the weather. I tell you, damp air, bad for the mind. Mrs. Bantry shot him a look. Oh, do be quiet, Mr. Pye. You can sit explain away 3 people feeling the same thing. I'm starting to think that sits something wicked going on. Dr. Hayward raised an eyebrow, his tone dry. Wicked? Surely not, Mrs. Bantry. A prankster, perhaps, taking advantage of the fog. Some lads playing tricks. I sit wager. Miss Marple's sixth eyes lingered on the doctor, noting the ease with which he dismissed the incident. She turned to Miss Price. You mentioned footsteps running. Could you tell which direction they went? Miss Price hesitated. Toward the church, I think. But it was so faint, and the fog muffles everything. Oh, Miss Marple, what if it comes back? We shall take care to see it doesn't set, Miss Marple said, her voice reassuring. Now let's get you to the bakery. To Dr. Hayward is right. You need warmth and rest. As the group escorted Miss Price to her brother's shop, Miss Marple lagged behind, her eyes scanning the green. The fog was too thick to see much, but she noted the ground was soft from recent rain, likely preserving footprints if one looked closely. She made a mental note to return in the morning when the light was better. The green was a central place, unlike the isolated mill or churchyard lane, and that puzzled her. Why here, where someone might easily witness the act? Unless, of course, the fog itself was the key. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire. Her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. Cherry, still shaken, poured tea with a trembling hand. 3 times now, Miss Marple, she said. It's getting worse, isn't it? What if it's not a person at all? Mrs. Hayes going on about curses, and I know it's silly, but not silly at all, Cherry. Miss Marple said gently. Fear makes us imagine all sorts of things, but I find it interesting that each incident happens in the fog, and always at night. It starts almost as if someone or something needs the cover of mist to move unseen. Cherry shivered. You think it sets a person then? Not a ghost? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ghosts, in my experience, are rarely so particular about the weather. But people can be very clever indeed. I remember a case in Kimpton years ago where a thief used the fog to steal from market stalls. He was never seen, only felt, a brush of a hand, a tug at a purse. The villagers called him a spirit until he was caught with a sack of apples. Cherry Sip's eyes widened. You think it sets a thief? I think, Miss Marple said, her tone mild, that we must keep our eyes open and our minds clear. Tomorrow I shall take a walk to the green and perhaps call on Miss Price, and I think a chat with Peter Grimsby's mother might be in order. People often know more than they say, Cherry, especially when they're frightened. As Cherry nodded and cleared the tea tray, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the three incidents: Mrs. Finch, alone at the mill; Peter Grimsby, in the churchyard lane; now Miss Price, on the open green, each touched by cold hands, each in the fog, each left shaken but unharmed. Yet the pattern felt incomplete, like a shawl with missing stitches. She thought of the rustle Miss Price mentioned, the smell of damp wool. Small details, perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead, small details often led to larger truths. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and Miss Marple's needles clicked on. The village was afraid, and fear, she knew, could be a dangerous thing. It could blind people to the obvious, or drive someone to act. She would watch, and listen, and wait. For whoever was behind the shadow with cold hands, they were bound to make a mistake. And when they did, Miss Jane Marple would be ready. Chapter 5. The Inspector Sets Arrival. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a reluctant sun, its rays struggling through a veil of thinning fog that clung to the rooftops like a lingering guest. The village green, scene of Miss Price's fright the previous evening, lay quiet, its grass damp and trampled from the night's commotion. Miss Jane Marple stood at its edge, her sensible shoes planted firmly on the path, her eyes scanning the ground with the precision of a botanist studying rare flora. She had risen early, as was her habit, and slipped out before Cherry could protest about the chill. The green offered little in the way of clues: muddy patches, indistinct footprints, a few broken twigs, but Miss Marple noted them all, her mind weaving them into the tapestry of the mystery. She was not alone for long. The crunch of gravel announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a youngish man with a brisk manner and a reputation for efficiency, sent from the county police to investigate the growing unease in St. Mary Mead. He was no stranger to the village, having crossed paths with Miss Marple during a previous case involving a stolen brooch. He respected her, though he sometimes found her gentle probing exasperating, as if she saw threads he could not. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat as he approached. "I might sib known you sib be here, poking about. Heard about Miss Price sib's scare last night. I take it." "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild as she straightened, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "A most unsettling business. 3 incidents now, all so similar. I imagine you sip been called in to put the village sept's mind at ease." Craddock's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Something like that. The chief constable's getting complaints, people locking their doors, refusing to go out after dark. Can't say I blame them, with all this talk of cold hands and shadows. But between you and me, I suspect it's a prankster with too much time on their hands. Probably some lads having a laugh." Miss Marple Sixth's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "Perhaps, though it sits a bold prankster who strikes 3 times in such a short span, don't sit you think, and always in the fog, where no one can see." Craddock raised an eyebrow, adjusting his notebook. "You've got a point there. I've spoken to Mrs. Finch and Peter Grimsby already. Both stick to their stories. Cold hands, no figure, just the fog. Miss Price is next on my list. Any thoughts, Miss Marple? I know you've a knack for seeing what others miss." "Oh, I'm only an old woman with too much time for gossip," she said lightly, but her gaze was sharp. "But I do find it curious that each incident occurs in a different part of the village. The mill, the churchyard, now the green. It's almost as if someone is testing the ground, seeing how far they can go." Craddock scribbled a note, his brow furrowing. Testing, you say? That's an interesting angle. You think it sits deliberate, then not just random mischief. I think, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking faintly as she drew them from her bag, that people rarely act without purpose, even if that purpose seems foolish to others. I recall a case in my youth, in Little Worthing, where a series of thefts seemed random until we realized the thief was mapping the village's routines. Perhaps our shadow is doing something similar. Craddock looked thoughtful, but before he could reply, a commotion drew their attention. Mrs. Bantry was hurrying across the green, her coat flapping, followed by a small knot of villagers, Mrs. Hay, Miss Cram, and Mr. Clement, the vicar, whose face was pale and drawn. "Inspector, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry called, breathless. "You still never believe it. There's still's been another incident, not an hour ago, near the old oak by the river path. It's Sybil's Mrs. Wicks, the seamstress. She sews in a state, says she felt those cold hands, just like the others." The villagers murmured, their voices a mix of fear and excitement. Mrs. Hay clutched her shawl, muttering about curses, while Miss Cram's eyes gleamed with a mix of terror and fascination. Mr. Clement wrung his hands, his voice low. "This is getting out of hand, Inspector. The parish is in a panic. We must do something." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Right. I sit'll head to Mrs. Wicks now. Miss Marple, care to join me? Your presence seems to calm people." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I sit be happy to, Inspector. Mrs. Wicks is a steady soul, not easily rattled. Her account may tell us something new." The group made their way to Mrs. Wicks' cottage, a neat little house on the edge of the village, its garden bordered by the river path. Mrs. Wicks, a wiry woman in her 50s, sat by her fire, a cup of tea untouched on the table. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was firm as she recounted her ordeal. "I was coming back from delivering a dress to Mrs. Bantry," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "It was just before dawn, the fog thick as porridge. I was by the old oak. You know the one, twisted like a claw. I heard a rustle, like someone moving through the grass, and then hands cold as death grabbed my shoulders. I screamed and swung my basket, but there was nothing there, just the fog and that horrible chill." "Did you hear anything else?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Footsteps, perhaps, or a particular sound?" Mrs. Wicks frowned, thinking. "There was a sort of creak, like old leather, or a gate, and a smell musty, like wet cloth left too long in a cupboard. But it was so quick, I thought I imagined it, until I heard about the others." Craddock jotted notes, his expression grim. "Thank you, Mrs. Wicks. This is helpful. Can you confirm the time? And did anyone else see you on the path?" "No one," she said. "It was too early, and the fog was dreadful. As for the time, I set say about 5:00. I like to start my day early." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the details. 4 incidents now, each in the fog, each with cold hands and no clear sighting. The locations were spreading: mill, churchyard, green, now the river path. She noted the creak Mrs. Wicks mentioned, similar to Miss Price's rustle, and the musty smell, echoing the damp wool Miss Price had described. Small threads, but they were beginning to form a pattern. As Craddock questioned Mrs. Wicks further, Miss Marple stepped outside, ostensibly to admire the garden. The river path was narrow, bordered by reeds, and overshadowed by the gnarled oak. She examined the ground, finding it soft and muddy, with a few scuffed marks that might be footprints or might not. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air was still heavy, the river's murmur a soft counterpoint to the village's unease. Back inside, Craddock was wrapping up. "We still patrol the village tonight," he said, addressing the gathered villagers. "If this is a prankster, we still catch them. In the meantime, try not to walk alone, especially in the fog." Mrs. Hay snorted. "Patrols one fit stop a ghost inspector? It's Stas Josiah Black. I tell you, my grandmother said he swore vengeance on this village." Miss Cram clutched her novel, her voice trembling. "Or a vampire. I read that they move in the mist, silent as shadows." Craddock sighed, but Miss Marple spoke before he could respond. It's curious, isn't it, how the fog seems to be our shadow-sit's ally. I wonder if it's the fog itself that gives them courage. In my experience, darkness and mist can embolden those who wish to go unseen." Her words hung in the air, and she noted the reactions: Mrs. Hay's frown, Miss Cram's wide-eyed nod, Mr. Clement's nervous glance toward the window. Craddock gave her a sharp look, as if sensing she was nudging at something he hadn't yet grasped. As they left Mrs. Wicks's cottage, Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts racing. 4 incidents, each in a different corner of the village, each with a similar yet slightly varied account. The rustle, the creak, the musty smell. She thought of a maid she'd once known, who used a damp cloak to slip through a manor unnoticed, her movements masked by the weather. Could someone in St. Mary Mead be playing a similar game? And if so, why? Fear was a powerful tool, but to what end? She glanced at Craddock, who was deep in conversation with Mrs. Bantry about patrols. He was thorough, but young and inclined to see pranks where there might be purpose. She thought of Dr. Hayward's dismissive chuckle at the tea party, Mr. Pye's insistence on miasma, Miss Cram's lurid imagination. Each had a role in the village's drama, and each perhaps knew more than they let on. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes lingering on the misty horizon. The shadow with cold hands was no ghost, of that she was certain, but it was clever, and it was bold, and it was stirring St. Mary Mead into a frenzy. She would need to tread carefully, listening to the village's pulse, for the truth, she suspected, was closer than anyone realized. Chapter 6: Echoes of the Past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the vicarage garden, where Miss Jane Marple sat on a wrought-iron bench, her knitting needles moving in a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. Clement had invited her for tea, ostensibly to discuss the church fete, but Miss Marple suspected the vicar had more on his mind than flower arrangements and tombola prizes. The incidents of the shadow with cold hands had escalated to 4, and the village was alive with whispers of ghosts and curses. Inspector Craddock's patrols had yielded nothing, and the fog mercifully had lifted for a day or 2, but the fear lingered like a bad dream. Mr. Clement emerged from the vicarage, carrying a tray laden with tea and biscuits. He was a mild-mannered man, scholarly and kind, but today his face bore lines of worry that aged him beyond his years. He set the tray down with a slight clatter, his hands unsteady. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," he said, pouring tea with exaggerated care. "I know you're busy with everything that's happening, but I thought perhaps we could talk. The parish is in such a state, and I feel responsible, somehow." Miss Marple accepted her cup, her eyes gentle, but probing. "Responsible, Mr. Clement? How so? These incidents are hardly the work of the church." The vicar sighed, sinking into the chair opposite her. Perhaps not directly, but all this talk of ghosts, Josiah Black's curse, they say. It's tied to the old mill, you know, and the church has records going back centuries. People are looking to me for answers, and I have none, only prayers, and those seem inadequate against whatever this is. Josiah Black, Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. I've heard the name mentioned more than once. Mrs. Hay seems convinced he's behind it all. What do you know of him, Vicar? The truth, not the gossip. Mr. Clement hesitated, stirring his tea absently. It's an old story, Miss Marple, from the 1880s. Josiah Black was the miller owned the old mill by the river. He was a hard man, they say, quick with his fists and slow to forgive debts. There was a scandal. His wife ran off with a travelling salesman, or so the tale goes. Black drowned himself in the mill pond, cursing the village for its gossip and judgment. The church buried him in unconsecrated ground near the churchyard lane. Some say his spirit wanders, seeking revenge. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was turning over the details like pages in a well-worn book. Unconsecrated ground, you say, near where Peter Grimsby had his fright, and the mill, Mrs. Finch's home now. How interesting. Was there more to the story? Grudges that lingered? The vicar nodded slowly. Oh yes. Black had enemies. He foreclosed on several farms during a bad harvest, including one owned by the ancestor of Mr. Pye's family, and there was talk of foul play. Some whispered that Black didn't drown himself, but was pushed, but it was ruled a suicide, and the matter dropped. The mill passed to distant relatives, and eventually to Mrs. Finch's late husband. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the past. She recalled a similar tale from her girlhood in a neighbouring village, where a miller's ghost was blamed for mishaps until it was revealed to be a rival sabotaging the machinery. Human nature doesn't change much, does it? She said softly. Old grudges can fester like untended wounds. I wonder if someone is stirring those echoes deliberately. Mr. Clement looked startled. You think this shadow is man-made, not a prank, but something tied to the past? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice mild, that the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected. Like that business in Chipping Cleghorn a few years back, old secrets coming to light through seemingly random events. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hayward, who strode into the garden with his usual confident gait, his medical bag swinging. Vicar, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not intruding. I was passing and thought I'd check on you, Clement. You looked peaky at the tea party. Mr. Clement managed a weak smile. Kind of you, Doctor. Just the strain of it all. We've been discussing Josiah Black. Dr. Hayward chuckled, pulling up a chair uninvited. Ah, the ghostly miller, village folklore at its finest. I must say, it's fascinating, from a psychological standpoint, mass hysteria triggered by a few chills in the fog. I've seen similar cases in London, where fog and fear create phantoms. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the doctor, noting his easy dismissal. You don't believe in ghosts then, Doctor? Not a bit, he replied, accepting a biscuit. I'm a man of science. These cold hands are likely psychosomatic, people expecting to feel something, so they do. Or perhaps a mild toxin in the air, from the river. Miasma, as Mr. Pye calls it. The vicar frowned, but 4 people. Doctor all describing the same thing. Surely that's more than imagination. Dr. Hayward shrugged. Coincidence amplified by gossip. Take Mrs. Wicks. She delivered a dress to Mrs. Bantry, who loves a good story. Peter Grimsby works at the pub, where tales flow with the ale. Miss Price hears everything at the bakery. Mrs. Finch, well, she's isolated, prone to fancies. It's a chain reaction. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her needles resuming their click. A chain, you say? How perceptive. And yet each incident has small differences. The rustle, the creak, the musty smell, almost as if someone is varying their approach, learning as they go. Dr. Hayward's chuckle faded slightly, his eyes sharpening. You make it sound sinister, Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock thinks it's pranks. What do you think? Oh, I don't think much, she said lightly. But I do observe. For instance, you've been in St. Mary Mead only a month, Doctor, yet you seem well versed in our little histories. Have you family connections here? The doctor hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Miss Marple caught it. No family, no, but I make it a point to learn about my patients. Helps build trust. Dr. Lloyd left thorough notes, and the villagers are chatty. Quite so, Miss Marple murmured. She thought of the old doctor's retirement, sudden and unexplained, and the arrival of this young, ambitious replacement. Notes could tell much, but not everything. As the conversation turned to the feet, Miss Marple excused herself, citing the need for a walk. She strolled toward the old mill, her steps unhurried, her mind piecing together fragments. Josiah Black's curse, enemies in the village, Mr. Pye's ancestor ruined, perhaps others. She recalled Cherry, mentioning that Peter Grimsby's grandfather had worked at the mill, and Miss Price's brother, the baker, had once quarrelled with Mrs. Finch over land boundaries. Mrs. Wicks, too, had sewn dresses for Black's wife, or so the old stories went. At the mill, Mrs. Finch was in her garden, weeding with vigorous pulls. She straightened as Miss Marple approached, her face wary but welcoming. Miss Marple, come for more questions. The inspector grilled me enough this morning. Only a chat, my dear, Miss Marple said, admiring the roses. Such lovely blooms. Your husband had a green thumb, I recall. Mrs. Finch softened. He did. Inherited the mill from his uncle, who got it cheap after Black's death. Folks said it was cursed, but we've managed fine until now. Until the cold hands, Miss Marple prompted gently. You felt them in your bedroom? Yes? Not outside, like the others. Mrs. Finch shivered. Yes, right by my bed. I thought it was a dream at first, but the chill was real, and I swear I heard a whisper, like justice or something, but that could be my mind, playing tricks. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A whisper? No one else had mentioned that. Justice, you say? How intriguing. And you've no enemies? Mrs. Finch? No old disputes? The widow hesitated. Well, there was that row with the baker over the fence line, but that's settled. And Mr. Pye once accused my husband of short-changing on stamps, but that's years ago. Miss Marple nodded, storing the information. As she left the mill, the river gurgled beside her, its waters dark and secretive, echoes of the past. Indeed, Josiah Black's death ruled suicide, but whispered murder, grudges that spanned generations. And now, a shadow stirring them up, touching villagers with cold hands that left no mark but fear. She thought of Dr. Hayward's brief hesitation, the vicar's worry, the inspector's frustration. Someone was weaving a web, using the fog and the legend to mask their intent. But what was the motive? Revenge, distraction, or something more personal? As she reached her cottage, the sun dipped lower, casting the village in a golden light that belied the shadows within. Miss Marple entered, her mind alert. The past was speaking, and she was listening closely, for in St. Mary Mead, history had a habit of repeating itself, and old sins cast long shadows. Chapter 7. The Midnight Visitor. The clock in Miss Jane Marple's cottage struck midnight with a soft, resonant chime that echoed through the quiet rooms. The village of St. Mary Mead lay shrouded in darkness, the fog having mercifully stayed away for another night, allowing the stars to prick the sky like distant pinpoints. Miss Marple had retired early, as was her custom, but sleep eluded her. Her mind, sharp as ever, turned over the echoes of the past she had uncovered at the vicarage, the tale of Josiah Black, the miller's curse, the old grudges that seemed to weave through the village like ivy on ancient walls. She lay in bed, her knitting set aside on the nightstand, listening to the faint creaks of the house settling. A soft tap at the window startled her, though she showed no outward sign of alarm. Rising quietly, she slipped on her dressing gown and moved to the curtain, peering out into the garden. The moon cast a silvery glow, illuminating a figure huddled by the gate. Peter Grimsby, the young bakery lad, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting pursuit. Miss Marple opened the door softly, her voice a whisper. "Peter, what brings you here at this hour? Come in, child, before you catch your death." Peter slipped inside, his boots muddy on the rug, his breath coming in short gasps. "Miss Marple, I didn't know where else to go. It's happened again to me. Those cold hands, but this time I saw something. Or thought I did." Miss Marple guided him to the sitting room, lighting a lamp and stoking the embers in the fire. Cherry, roused by the noise, appeared in her nightdress, rubbing her eyes. "Shall I make tea, Miss Marple?" "Yes, dear. And perhaps some biscuits for Peter. He looks as if he needs them." As Cherry bustled off, Miss Marple turned to the boy, her tone gentle but insistent. "Now, tell me everything, from the beginning. Where were you?" Peter sank into a chair, his hands trembling. "I was at the Blue Boar, helping close up again. Mr. Hargreaves let me off late past 11. I took the long way home, avoiding the churchyard after last time. But by the old oak near the river, it happened. The fog wasn't thick, but there was a mist off the water. I felt the hands cold, grabbing my arm. I twisted away and ran, but I looked back, and I swear I saw a shadow, like a tall figure in a cloak, slipping into the trees." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained kind. "A cloak, you say? Could you make out any features, height, build?" Peter shook his head. "It was too dark and quick, but it was real, Miss Marple, not a ghost. I heard footsteps crunching leaves and that same musty smell, like old clothes from an attic." Cherry returned with tea, her ears pricked for the story. "Another one? The inspector's patrols must have missed it. Did you tell anyone else?" "Not yet," Peter admitted, sipping the hot tea gratefully. "I came straight here. You're always so calm, Miss Marple, and you listen without judging. Folks say you're clever about these things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People exaggerate, my dear, but I'm glad you came. Now, think carefully. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Strangers in the village, or perhaps arguments among the regulars at the pub?" Peter frowned, thinking, well, Dr. Hayward was at the Blue Boar earlier, chatting with Mr. Pye. They seemed tense, like they were arguing in whispers. Something about old debts or settling scores. I didn't catch much, too busy with the glasses. And Miss Cram's been in a state, borrowing books from the lending library about ghosts and such. Old debts, Miss Marple murmured, her mind connecting threads. Josiah Black's foreclosures, Mr. Pye's family ruined. Could the postmaster harbour resentment? And Dr. Hayward, new to the village, but quick to know its secrets. She recalled his hesitation at the vicarage, his dismissal of the incidents as hysteria. "Thank you, Peter. You've been very helpful. Stay here tonight if you like. The spare room is made up. We'll speak to Inspector Craddock in the morning." Peter nodded gratefully, exhaustion overtaking his fear. As Cherry showed him upstairs, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her thoughts racing. A midnight visitor, a glimpsed figure in a cloak. This was progress of a sort. The shadow was growing bolder, or perhaps careless. She thought of her nephew Raymond's detective novels, where the culprit often revealed themselves through overconfidence. But this felt different, more calculated, as if the incidents were building to something. The next morning dawned, crisp and clear, the village stirring with its usual routines.
Hey!
Miss Marple sent Peter home with a note for his mother, then made her way to Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry was hosting an impromptu gathering to discuss the latest patrols. Inspector Craddock was there, looking frustrated over his coffee, flanked by Mrs. Bantry, Mr. Clement, and surprisingly Dr. Hayward. "Another incident," Craddock exclaimed as Miss Marple recounted Peter's tale. "That's 5 now, and he saw a figure. Why didn't he come to me straight away?" "Youthful fear, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly, accepting a seat. "He trusted an old woman to listen first. But the details are telling. A cloak, footsteps, that musty smell again. It suggests someone disguising themselves, perhaps with an old garment to mask their scent or appearance." Dr. Hayward leaned forward, his tone skeptical, or the boy's imagination running wild. "He's been frightened before. It's easy to see shapes in the dark. As for the smell, river dampness, nothing more." Mrs. Bantry snorted. "You're quick to dismiss, Doctor. If it's not imagination, what then? Someone playing ghost for fun? Or for profit?" Miss Marple interjected softly. "Old grudges, as the vicar mentioned. Josiah Black ruined families. Mr. Pye's among them, I believe." Mr. Clement nodded uncomfortably. "Yes, the Pye farm was lost, but that was generations ago. Surely no one holds a grudge now." Inspector Craddock's eyes sharpened. "Mr. Pye. He's been vocal about it being miasma, a deflection perhaps. I'll question him again." Dr. Hayward shifted in his seat. "Careful, Inspector. Accusations without evidence could stir more trouble. I'm new here, but even I see how gossip spreads." Miss Marple's gaze rested on the doctor. "Quite right. But newcomers can bring fresh perspectives or old connections. Dr. Lloyd mentioned in his letters that you trained under a colleague in Devon, where there was a similar case of ghostly touches years ago. Turned out to be a herbalist using chilled gloves to scare rivals." Dr. Hayward's smile faltered. Yes, I recall the story. Oh, but that was harmless pranks. Nothing like this." The gathering broke up soon after. With Craddock heading to the post office, Miss Marple walked slowly home, stopping at the bakery to chat with Miss Price. The baker's sister was still shaken, but added a detail. During her encounter on the green, she'd heard a faint jingle, like keys or coins in a pocket. Keys, Miss Marple mused later, knitting by her window. The postmaster had keys, the doctor his medical bag, the vicar the church keys. Small clues, but accumulating, and Peter's mention of old debts between Pye and Heywood. Could they be connected to Black's legacy? That afternoon, Cherry burst in with news. Miss Marple. Mrs. Hay says Mr. Pye and the doctor had a row at the shop, something about papers from the old mill. Mr. Pye stormed off, red as a beet. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. Papers, you say? How intriguing. Perhaps it's time for a visit to Mr. Pye. At the post office, Mr. Pye was sorting mail with jerky movements, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Miss Marple, if you're here about the shadow nonsense, I've told the inspector. It's all fog and fancy. Oh, I believe you, Miss Marple said soothingly. But I wondered about your family's history with the mill. Such a sad business, losing the farm. Pye's hands stilled. Ancient history. My grandfather was cheated, but we've moved on. Why dredge it up? Because someone might not have moved on, she replied. Papers from the mill deeds, perhaps? Or debts unpaid? Pye flushed. That's private. The doctor was asking nosy questions. That's all. Said he was researching village health records for some study. Rubbish, if you ask me. Miss Marple nodded, excusing herself. Health records? Dr. Heywood's excuse? Or a cover for digging into Black's scandal? She recalled the whisper Mrs. Finch heard. Justice. Revenge for old wrongs. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, piecing the puzzle. The midnight visitor had brought clarity, but also danger. The shadow was no longer content with touches. It was showing itself, escalating. She must be careful, for in St. Mary Mead, the past was not buried deep, and someone was determined to unearth it with cold, calculated hands. Chapter 8. Allies and Suspicions. The sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished wood floor. It was mid-morning, and the village of St. Mary Mead hummed with its customary activity. Children scampering to school, the milkman clinking bottles on doorsteps, and the distant chime of the church bell calling for a midday service. Yet beneath the normalcy lurked an undercurrent of unease, fed by the 5 incidents of the shadow with cold hands. Whispers in the shops and over garden fences spoke of curses, pranks, or worse, and Inspector Craddock's investigations had only stirred the pot further. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, penning a note to her nephew Raymond, though her mind was far from family pleasantries. The events of the previous night, Peter Grimsby's midnight visit, the glimpsed figure in a cloak, had sharpened her focus. She needed allies, unlikely ones perhaps, to probe deeper without arousing suspicion. Gossip was a tool, but directed conversation could reveal motives hidden in plain sight. A knock at the door interrupted her. Cherry answered, ushering in an unexpected visitor. Miss Cream, the dressmaker, clutching a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Her face was flushed, her eyes darting, as if she expected the shadow to emerge from the hedgerows. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not bothering you, Miss Cream said breathlessly, perching on the edge of a chair. But I had to come. After all this talk of shadows and cold hands, I couldn't sleep a wink, and then I remembered something from one of my books perhaps, but it feels real. Miss Marple set her pen aside, her expression inviting. Do tell, my dear. You've been reading those thrilling novels again. I take it. They can be most illuminating, in their way. Miss Cram unwrapped the parcel, revealing a worn leather-bound book titled Tales of the Supernatural. It's this one. There's a story about a vengeful spirit that touches victims with icy fingers, driving them mad. But last night I heard a noise outside my window, like a rustle, and I thought, what if it's not supernatural? What if it's someone pretending? Miss Marple's interest piqued. Miss Cram, with her vivid imagination, might prove an unlikely ally. Her fears could lead to overlooked details. A pretense, you say? That's a clever thought. Have you noticed anything unusual among your customers? People confide in dressmakers, I find, while pinning hems or fitting sleeves. Miss Cram leaned forward, her voice dropping. Well, yes. Mrs. Wicks mentioned that Dr. Hayward ordered new gloves, thick ones for the cold, he said, but it's not that chilly yet. And Mr. Pye came in for mending on an old cloak, musty thing, smelled like it'd been in storage for years. He was snappish about it, said it was for a costume at the fete. Gloves and a cloak, echoing Peter's description, and the musty smell, reported by several victims. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. How observant of you, Miss Cram. And the doctor, has he seemed preoccupied? Oh, terribly. Miss Cram confided. He was chatting with Mr. Pye the other day, something about debts from the past, and making things right. I overheard while measuring curtains for the post office. It sounded heated, like they shared a secret. Miss Marple filed the information away, her mind connecting it to Peter's eavesdropping at the pub. An alliance between the postmaster and the doctor, or a confrontation? You've been most helpful, my dear. Perhaps we could keep this between us, and if you hear more, do pop by. 2 heads are better than 1, especially when one's as imaginative as yours. Miss Cram beamed, flattered. I'd like that, Miss Marple. It's exciting, in a scary way, like being in one of my books. After Miss Cram departed, Miss Marple donned her hat and set out for a walk, her destination the vicarage. Mr. Clement could be another ally. His position granted access to village histories, and his gentle nature made him a good listener. She found him in the study, poring over yellowed parish records, his brow furrowed. Miss Marple, a welcome sight, he said, rising to greet her. I've been digging into Josiah Black's era, as you suggested. The records are spotty, but there's mention of a disputed will. Black left everything to a nephew, but it was contested by creditors, including the Pye family. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her eyes bright. Contested how? Forgery, perhaps? Possibly, the vicar replied. The nephew vanished shortly after, and the mill went to auction. Dr. Lloyd, our old doctor, once mentioned his predecessor treated Black for injuries before the drowning. Bruises, as if from a fight. But it was hushed up. Injuries, suggesting murder, not suicide. And Dr. Hayward, successor to Dr. Lloyd, digging into health records. Miss Marple probed gently. You've a kind ear, Vicar. Has anyone confided in you about recent troubles, fears beyond the shadow? Mr. Clement hesitated, then sighed. Mrs. Finch came for counsel yesterday. She's worried about old letters she found in the mill, debts owed by Black, signed over to her husband's family. She thinks someone wants them, to stir trouble. And Peter Grimsby mentioned his grandfather worked for Black, witnessed something shady but kept quiet. Miss Marple's needles, drawn from her bag, began their rhythmic click. Shady, you say? How fortunate that people trust you. Perhaps you could mention to Inspector Craddock that these connections warrant a look, discreetly of course. We wouldn't want to alarm anyone. The vicar nodded. Relieved. I'll do that. It's good to have guidance, Miss Marple. I feel out of my depth with all this intrigue. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple felt the web tightening, allies in Miss Cram and Mr. Clement, unlikely but useful. Their observations pointed to Mr. Pye and Dr. Hayward, with motives rooted in the past: debts, disputed wills, possible murder. The Shadow's touches could be a campaign of terror to force revelations or retrieve documents. Her walk took her past the post office, where Mr. Pye was arguing with a customer over stamps. She paused, feigning interest in postcards, and caught snippets. "Those papers are mine, by right, doctor, or no doctor." Pye's voice was sharp, his face red. Intriguing. Miss Marple continued to the surgery, where Dr. Hayward was seeing patients. She waited in the antechamber, chatting with the nurse, who confided that the doctor had been burning old files late at night. "Clearing space," he said, but the smell lingered. When her turn came, Miss Marple complained of a minor ache, using it as pretext. "You've settled in quickly, doctor," she said conversationally. "Researching our history, I hear. Josiah Black's tale must be fascinating for a man of science." Hayward's pen paused. "History informs health, Miss Marple, hereditary conditions and such. Black's family had rheumatism, cold hands run in the line, ironically." "Cold hands," she echoed mildly, "like our shadow." "You've ordered gloves. I understand. Sensible. With the chill coming." His smile was tight. "Yes, for evening walks. The fog can be biting." As she left, Miss Marple noted his unease. Evening walks, in the fog perhaps. Suspicions mounted, but she needed proof. That evening, she hosted Cherry and Peter for tea, probing the boy further. "The cloak you saw, was it long, like a cape?" Peter nodded. "Yes, and bulky, like it hid something underneath." "Bulky, perhaps concealing papers or tools." Miss Marple enlisted Peter as another ally. "Keep your ears open at the pub, dear. Whispers about debts or the mill." As night fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire. Her alliances formed: Miss Cram for gossip, the vicar for history, Peter for youth's boldness. Motives swirled: revenge for ruined families, hidden murder, lost fortunes. The shadow was human, driven by greed or justice, and her subtle dialogues were unraveling the threads. But suspicions bred danger. She must tread carefully, for allies could turn, and the cold hands might strike closer to home. Chapter 9. The Garden of Secrets. The late morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp bite, a reminder that autumn was settling in with its golden leaves and lengthening shadows. Miss Jane Marple stood in the vicarage garden, her sensible hat shielding her eyes from the sun as she bent to inspect a patch of overgrown herbs near the low stone wall. Mr. Clement had invited her to advise on the church fete's flower stall, but Miss Marple had suggested a stroll through the garden, her keen eyes drawn to the neglected plot where mint and thyme tangled with weeds. She had a hunch that secrets, like plants, often hid in plain sight, and the vicarage, so close to the churchyard lane where Peter Grimsby had been touched, seemed a likely place to look. Mr. Clement trailed behind, his hands clasped nervously. "I'm afraid the garden-sit's been rather neglected since Mrs. Clement's illness last year," he said, his voice tinged with apology. The herbs were her pride, but now they sipped her a bit of a jungle. Miss Marple smiled, her fingers brushing a sprig of lavender. "A jungle can be most revealing, Vicar. Plants tell stories, where feet tread, where hands pluck. I recall a case in my youth where a thief trampled a rosebed, leaving a perfect footprint. Have you noticed anyone lingering here recently?" The vicar frowned, thinking, well, Dr. Hayward was here a few days ago, asking about medicinal herbs for his research. He seemed particularly interested in the nightshade, though I told him it's poisonous, and Mr. Pye often cuts through the garden to the post office. It's a shortcut from his cottage. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained mild. Nightshade, dangerous, but not linked to cold hands. And Mr. Pye's shortcut placed him near the churchyard, scene of one incident. She knelt, examining the soil, and noticed a patch of flattened earth near the wall, as if someone had stood there repeatedly. A faint glint caught her eye, a small tarnished button, half buried in the dirt. She slipped it into her pocket discreetly, noting its worn fabric backing, like that of an old coat or cloak. "Curious," she murmured, straightening. "This garden sees more traffic than one might expect. Perhaps we should ask Mrs. Bantry to join us. She has a keen eye for detail." Mr. Clement nodded, hurrying to send a message. As he left, Miss Marple continued her inspection, her thoughts turning to the clues, piling up: the musty cloak, the creak of leather, the jingle of keys, the whisper of justice. The button suggested carelessness, someone losing a piece of their disguise. She recalled a case in Kimpton where a button led to a tailor's shop, unravelling a smuggling ring. Could this button point to Mr. Pye's mended cloak or Dr. Hayward's gloves? Mrs. Bantry arrived shortly, her energy undimmed by the morning sip's chill. "Jane, you sips got that look in your eye," she said, striding over. "Found something juicy in the Vicar Sip's parsley patch." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Only a trifle, Dolly. But trifles can lead to truths. Have you noticed anyone lingering near the churchyard or vicarage lately? Someone, perhaps, who doesn't set belong." Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed. "Well, now you mention it, old Tom, our groundskeeper saw Dr. Hayward near the churchyard 2 nights ago, carrying a satchel. Said he was collecting samples. Botanical nonsense, if you ask me. And Miss Cram told me she saw Mr. Pye poking about the mill last week, muttering to himself. Oh, and there's young Tommy Pierce, always sneaking through gardens to avoid his mother's chores. Could he be playing pranks?" Miss Marple considered Tommy, the butcher's boy, but dismissed him for now. His mischief was petty, not calculated. Dr. Hayward and Mr. Pye keep cropping up, don't they? And both tied to the mill papers, debts, old grudges. I wonder if our shadow is digging for something specific, using fear to clear the way. Mrs. Bantry gasped. "You mean like treasure? Or those letters Mrs. Finch found?" "Oh, Jane, this is better than a novel." "Not treasure, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she drew them from her bag. "But knowledge documents that prove a wrong or hide a crime. Josiah Black's death was called suicide, but bruises suggest otherwise. If someone believes it was murder, they might seek justice or leverage." Their conversation paused as Mr. Clement returned, followed by Inspector Craddock, who looked weary but alert. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he greeted. "I've just come from the mill. Mrs. Finch showed me those letters, debts signed by Black, some to Pye's grandfather, others to a merchant named Grimsby, Peter's great-grandfather. I'd wager she's nervous, thinks someone's been watching her cottage at night." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Watching, you say? That sits bold. Did she describe anyone?" "No, just shadows in the fog," Craddock replied. "But I found footprints near her gate, men's boots, deep treads. I could be anyone, but I've sent them for analysis, and I'm keeping an eye on Pye and Hayward." Their argument about mill papers is suspicious. Pye claims they're family heirlooms, but Haywood says they're public record. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. A feud. I knew it. Jane, you think one of them sips our shadow. Dom situ. I think, Miss Marple said mildly, that motives are like weeds in this garden, plentiful, but not all are harmful. We must uproot the right one. Inspector, have you considered the churchyard itself, unconsecrated ground, where Black was buried? If someone believes he was wronged, they might stage these touches near his grave to stir guilt. Craddock nodded thoughtfully. Worth checking. I still have my men search the churchyard tonight, and I am planning a trap, staging a patrol that looks lax, hoping to lure the shadow out. Miss Marple inclined her head. A wise plan, but do be cautious. Our shadow is clever, and fear makes people unpredictable. As Craddock and Mrs. Bantry discussed logistics, Miss Marple wandered to the garden's edge, where the churchyard wall loomed. She examined the button in her pocket, its fabric frayed but sturdy, like something from a workman's coat or a miller's cloak. She thought of Dr. Haywood's gloves, ordered for cold evenings, and Mr. Pye's mended cloak, musty from storage. Red herrings, perhaps, but the garden was whispering secrets. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the bakery, where Miss Price was rolling dough with nervous energy. I keep thinking about that jingle I heard, Miss Price confided, like keys but heavier. Maybe tools. My brother says Mr. Pye's been buying odd things at the hardware shop. Nails, wire, nothing big, but regular. Tools. Another thread. Miss Marple thanked her and stopped by the lending library, where Miss Cram was sorting books. Any more on that cloak, my dear? Miss Marple asked. Miss Cram blushed. Well, I didn't say before, but Mr. Pysett's cloak had a tear near the hem, like it caught on something thorny. And Dr. Haywood borrowed a book on local plants, said it was for allergies, but he lingered over the nightshade pages. Nightshade again. Miss Marple's mind raced. A poisonous plant, though no one was harmed yet. Was it a red herring, or preparation for worse? She recalled a case in Devon where nightshade was used to scare, not kill, creating panic to mask theft. The shadow's touches left fear, not injury, perhaps a prelude to something larger. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting and thinking. The garden had yielded a button, the village gossip and debts, Mr. Pye's cloak, Haywood's gloves, Grimsby's ancestor, Finch's letters, all connected to Josiah Black's shadow, but the motive remained elusive: revenge, greed, or a twisted quest for justice. She needed one more clue to tie the threads, and the churchyard with its unconsecrated grave beckoned. Tomorrow she would walk there, for in St. Mary Mead secrets grew like weeds, and Miss Marple was an expert gardener. Chapter 10. Cold hands strike again. The fog rolled in over St. Mary Mead like a silent invader, blanketing the village in a thick, swirling veil that muffled sounds and obscured familiar landmarks. It was evening, the kind where lamps flickered dimly in cottage windows, and the streets emptied early, save for the occasional hurried figure darting homeward. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fireside, her knitting needles idle for once, her sharp eyes fixed on the window, where the mist pressed against the panes like curious fingers. She had spent the day mulling over the button from the vicarage garden, the whispers of debts and grudges, the persistent shadows cast by Josiah Black's long-ago death. The trap Inspector Craddock had planned, a feigned lax patrol near the churchyard, loomed in her thoughts, but so did the danger. Fear was making the village restless, and restlessness bred mistakes. A sharp rap at the door shattered the quiet. Cherry, who had been dozing over a magazine, jumped up to answer it. Moments later, she ushered in a dishevelled Mrs. Bantry, her coat askew and her face pale as milk. "Jane, it's happened again. Worse this time. Poor Mr. Clement. He's been attacked. And it's not just a touch. He's hurt." Miss Marple rose swiftly, her composure unshaken, though her heart quickened. "Hurt, you say? Tell me everything. Dolly, where is he now?" Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair, her hands trembling as Cherry fetched brandy. "At the vicarage. Inspector Craddock's there, and Dr. Hayward's tending him." It was just after dusk. Clement was walking the churchyard path, checking the grave markers for the fete display. He says he heard a rustle, then those cold hands grabbed him from behind, but this time they pushed him down. He hit his head on a stone, blood everywhere. He managed to cry out, and the sexton heard him, scared the shadow off. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing details. An escalation, from touches to violence. The churchyard, near Black's unconsecrated grave. Did he see anything? A cloak, perhaps, or a face? Mrs. Bantry shook her head. Nothing clear. The fog was too thick, but he whispered something about a creak, like leather, and that musty smell again. And Jane, he thinks he heard a voice. Justice for the wronged, or something like it. It's terrifying. Cherry, wide-eyed, interjected. "That's like what Mrs. Finch heard. It's getting bolder, Miss Marple. What if it's coming for all of us?" Miss Marple patted Cherry's hand reassuringly. "We mustn't panic, dear. Panic is the shadow's ally. Dolly, let's go to the vicarage at once. I want to hear Mr. Clement's account firsthand." The three women bundled into coats and ventured into the fog, the air damp and chill against their skin. The village felt eerie, the usual evening sounds, dogs barking, children calling, stifled by the mist. As they approached the vicarage, lights blazed from every window, and figures moved within like ghosts in a lantern show. Inspector Craddock met them at the door, his face grim. "Miss Marple." "Mrs. Bantry, good of you to come," he said, ushering them in. "The vicar's resting, but he's coherent. Dr. Hayward's bandaged his head. Concussion, but he'll recover. This changes things. It's assault now, not just harassment." In the study, Mr. Clement lay on the sofa, a bandage wrapped around his forehead, his eyes shadowed with pain, but alert. Dr. Hayward stood nearby, packing his bag, his expression a mix of concern and irritation. "He's lucky," the doctor said. "A deeper cut, and it could have been serious. I've given him something for the pain. Rest is key." Miss Marple approached gently, taking the vicar's hand. "My dear Mr. Clement, what a dreadful ordeal. Can you tell us what happened? Every detail matters." The vicar nodded weakly, his voice hoarse. "I was near the old graves by the unconsecrated plot. Black's marker, you know. The fog was dense, but I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate. Then the hands cold. So cold, gripping my shoulders. I struggled, and that's when it pushed me. I fell, hit the stone, but as I did, I glimpsed a shape, tall, cloaked, I think, and the voice, low and muffled, justice for the drowned. Then it was gone, melting into the fog." Dr. Hayward snorted softly. "Hallucination from the blow, perhaps. Fog plays tricks. And with all this talk of Black's curse—" Craddock interrupted, notebook in hand. "Not so fast, Doctor. The sexton saw a figure fleeing toward the river path, matches the description, and footprints in the mud, same deep treads as at the mill. We're searching the area now. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Haywood, noting his quick dismissal. You were out this evening, Doctor. House calls in the fog. Haywood met her gaze steadily. Yes, to Mrs. Hayes, her rheumatism flares in damp weather. Why do you ask? Only that your knowledge of herbs and such might be useful, Miss Marple said mildly. Nightshade in the vicarage garden. Did you collect any samples recently? The doctor's face tightened. For research, as I told the vicar, nothing sinister. As Haywood excused himself, Miss Marple turned to Craddock. Inspector, the escalation worries me. Touches to build fear, now violence to silence. Mr. Clement was digging into Black's records. Perhaps he found something threatening. Craddock nodded. I've thought the same. He mentioned a missing parish book, old wills and debts, stolen maybe. I'll check Pye. Again, his family's tied to those debts. Mrs. Bantry, hovering nearby, added, and Peter Grimsby's ancestor too. What if it's a descendant seeking revenge, or Haywood, new but prying into everything? The vicar stirred. There's more. Before the push, I felt something cold on the hands, not just chill, but slick, like oil or lotion, and a faint scent, herbal, bitter. Miss Marple's mind clicked. Slick coldness, perhaps chilled gloves, treated with something. Nightshade extract could numb skin, simulating icy death, a red herring, or a clue to the method. She recalled the button from the garden, its fabric matching descriptions of an old cloak. Alliances were testing. Craddock's trust in her insights, Mrs. Bantry's gossip network, even Miss Cram's observations. But suspicions lingered on Haywood and Pye, their arguments over papers now seeming more ominous. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked slowly through the fog, Mrs. Bantry at her side. It's tightening, Jane, the web. Who'll be next? Someone close to the truth. Miss Marple murmured, We must watch our steps, Dolly. The shadow strikes when least expected. Back home, Miss Marple examined the button under lamplight, noting a faint stain, oily, bitter-smelling. Herbal. She slipped it away, her thoughts on the river path, where the figure had fled. Tomorrow, she would search there, for the cold hands had struck again, drawing blood this time, and the intrigue was coiling like the fog itself, ready to engulf the unwary. Chapter 11. Whispers from the Grave. The morning after Mr. Clement's attack dawned grey and heavy, the fog lingering like a reluctant guest over St. Mary Mead. The village buzzed with unease, the news of the vicar's injury spreading faster than the Morning Post. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting untouched, a small notebook open before her. She had jotted down the latest clues, the slick, cold hands described by Mr. Clement, the herbal scent, the stolen parish book of wills and debts. The button from the vicarage garden, with its oily stain, rested in a saucer on her desk, a tangible link to the shadow's disguise. The escalation to violence marked a shift. Someone was growing desperate, and Miss Marple sensed the truth lay buried in the village's past, whispering from the grave of Josiah Black. Cherry bustled in with tea, her face pale. Miss Marple, the whole village is talking about the vicar. Mrs. Hay sips at it again, blaming that old Miller Sip's curse. And Mr. Pye was at the shop, snapping at everyone, says the Inspector Seps, hounding him unfairly. Do you think he Sip's hiding something? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. People often snap when they feel cornered. Cherry, Mr. Pye's family history with the mill is a sore point, and Dr. Hayward's interest in those papers hasn't helped, but we must be methodical. I'd like to visit the churchyard today, near the unconsecrated ground. There's a story there, I think." Cherry shivered.
That creepy plot?
"You set braver than me, Miss Marple. Shall I come along?" "No, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "but do keep your ears open at the post office. Whispers, as you know, can be most revealing." Armed with her umbrella, more for poking at the ground than for rain, Miss Marple set out for the churchyard. The path was muddy, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves and earth. The unconsecrated plot where Josiah Black was buried lay at the far end, marked by a weathered stone half hidden by brambles. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning for signs of disturbance. The soil around the grave was uneven, as if recently trodden, and a few bramble stems were snapped, their thorns catching threads of dark fabric. She knelt, careful not to disturb the scene, and retrieved a scrap of cloth, coarse, musty, like the cloak Peter had described. Her inspection was interrupted by footsteps. Inspector Craddock appeared, his coat dusted with mist, his face etched with frustration. "Miss Marple, I thought I stet find you here. You stet always one step ahead. Any discoveries?" She held up the scrap of cloth, her voice mild. "A trifle, Inspector. Found near Blacksit's grave. It matches descriptions of a cloak, perhaps the shadow Sit's costume. Have your men found anything in their search?" Craddock sighed, rubbing his neck. "More footprints, those deep-treaded boots leading from the churchyard to the river path, and a strange find, a vial, half buried near the oak. Empty, but it smells bitter, like herbs. I sent it for analysis. Could be nothing, or poison." Miss Marple's mind clicked. The herbal scent, the slick coldness, nightshade perhaps, diluted to numb the skin without killing. "Poison is dramatic," she said, "but fear is a subtler weapon. This shadow wants to terrify, not kill. Except for Mr. Clement. Why the push? Was he too close to something in those parish records?" Craddock nodded. "The missing book. It detailed Blacksit's will, contested by creditors like Pydesit's grandfather and Grimsby Sit's ancestor. If it proves foul play, someone might want it hidden. I Sit's bringing Pye in for questioning. And Hayward, he Sit's been cagey about his late-night Sits. As they spoke, Mrs. Bantry hurried up the path, her scarf flapping. "Jane, Inspector, you'll never guess." Mrs. Finch found another letter in her attic, tucked in an old trunk. It's from Black's nephew, claiming he was cheated out of the mill by a forged signature. She's beside herself, thinks someone's after it. And oh, this is rich. Miss Cram saw Dr. Hayward near the mill last night, carrying a lantern and digging. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Digging? That Sit's new. I Sit'll head there now. Miss Marple, care to join?" "I think I shall," she said, tucking the cloth scrap into her pocket beside the button. Mrs. Finch's letters are becoming quite the magnet. At the mill, Mrs. Finch greeted them with a mix of relief and agitation. The letter, yellowed and brittle, lay on her kitchen table, its ink faded but legible. It accused a village merchant, Grimsby's great-grandfather, of forging Black's will to seize the mill, with the Pye family complicit in spreading lies to ruin Black's name. "I found it yesterday," Mrs. Finch said, wringing her hands. "I was going to show the vicar, but then he was attacked. What if it's connected?" Miss Marple read the letter carefully, noting the angry scrawl. It's possible, my dear. This letter could stir old wounds or create new ones. Have you noticed anyone watching the mill?" Mrs. Finch nodded. Last week I saw a figure in the fog, tall, cloaked. I thought it was my imagination. But now, and those footprints outside my gate, like the ones you found, Inspector. Craddock examined the muddy yard, finding more deep-treaded prints leading toward the river. Same boots. This is no ghost. It's someone bold enough to dig and attack. Haywood Set's got explaining to do. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Craddock at the surgery, where Dr. Haywood was sorting files with forced calm. "Digging, Inspector," he said, his tone defensive. "I was collecting soil samples near the mill, testing for contamination. The river's been foul lately. As for the lantern, it's practical in fog." Miss Marple Sipt's voice was soft but piercing. "And the parish records, Doctor? You've been studying Black Sipt's death. Did you find evidence of murder, perhaps?" Haywood Sit's hand twitched. "Murder? That's Sit's village gossip. I researching hereditary conditions. Rheumatism, as I said. Cold hands run in families. Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "So you mentioned, but cold hands that push and terrify, that hist's less hereditary. I think." As they left, Craddock muttered, "He Set's hiding something. Those samples convenient excuse, and Pye Set's no better, dodging questions about his grandfather Sit's feud." Miss Marple paused by the river path, her eyes on the old oak. The letter changes things, Inspector. If Black was murdered, his nephew or a descendant might seek justice, or someone else wants that letter buried, using fear to distract. The churchyard grave, the mill, the river, all linked to Black's end. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread her clues on the table: the button, the cloth scrap, the vial's description, the oily stain, the herbal scent, perhaps a liniment, chilled to mimic death's touch. She recalled a case in her youth where a chemist used cooled salve to fake a haunting, driving tenants away to buy land cheap. Was this shadow after the mill, or the letter's proof? As night fell, she sat by the fire. Knitting resumed, but her mind alert. The scandal of Black's death, forgery, murder, lost fortunes, was resurfacing, and the shadow was its herald. But who wielded it? Haywood, with his research and gloves, Pye with his grudge and cloak, or another, hiding in plain sight? The whispers from the grave were growing louder, and Miss Marple knew the next strike would reveal more if she could stay one step ahead. Chapter 12. The Gathering Storm. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead hung heavy with the threat of rain, dark clouds rolling in to replace the fog that had plagued the village for weeks. The air was charged, as if the very atmosphere sensed the mounting tension in the wake of Mr. Clement's attack. The shadow with cold hands had struck 5 times, each incident more brazen, culminating in violence that left the vicar bruised and the village on edge. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting needles moving mechanically, her mind weaving together the threads of clues: the button, the cloth scrap, the oily herbal scent, the stolen parish book, and the damning letter found by Mrs. Finch. The whispers of Josiah Black's murder, buried for decades, were rising like a storm, and tonight she sensed would bring a reckoning. A knock at the door heralded Inspector Craddock, his face drawn but resolute. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside. "I've called a meeting at the vicarage. Discreet, just key players. Mrs. Finch is bringing that letter, and I've asked Mr. Pye, Dr. Haywood, and Mrs. Bantry to join. Peter Grimsby's coming too, since he's seen the shadow twice. I want to confront Pye and Haywood about those mill papers and see who flinches. You in?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside. her eyes bright. "I wouldn't miss it, Inspector. Confrontations can be most revealing, like shaking a tree to see what falls, but we must be cautious. The shadow is desperate now, and desperation breeds danger." Cherry, hovering nearby, looked anxious. "You sure it's set safe, Miss Marple? After what happened to the vicar?" "Safety lies in clarity, Cherry," Miss Marple replied gently. "And clarity comes from watching faces and listening to silences. Fetch my shawl, dear." The vicarage was ablaze with light when they arrived, its windows casting a warm glow against the brooding clouds. Inside, the study was crowded, the air thick with tension. Mr. Clement, his head still bandaged, sat by the fire, his expression weary but determined. Mrs. Finch clutched the letter, her knuckles white. Mr. Pye stood by the bookshelf, his spectacles glinting, his posture defensive. Dr. Hayward leaned against the mantel, his usual charm strained, his eyes darting. Mrs. Bantry perched on a chair, her gaze flicking between the men like a hawk. Peter Grimsby, pale but resolute, lingered near the door, as if ready to bolt. Craddock took charge, his voice firm. "Thank you all for coming. This shadow business has gone too far. 5 incidents, now an assault. Mrs. Finch, let's start with that letter. Read it aloud, if you please." Mrs. Finch's voice trembled as she unfolded the brittle paper. "It's from Josiah Black's nephew, dated 1883. The mill is mine by right, it says. Grimsby and Pye forged the will, slandered my uncle, drove him to ruin. I'll prove it, or my blood will curse this village. It's signed Thomas Black. All's the for, I for." A murmur rippled through the room. Peter Sipt's eyes widened, his great-grandfather implicated. Mr. Pye Sipt's face reddened, his fists clenching. "Lies," he snapped. "My grandfather was cheated, not the cheat. That mill should fit been ours." Dr. Hayward raised a hand, his tone calm but edged. "Let Sits not jump to conclusions. Forged wills are common in old disputes, hard to prove after decades. I studied Dr. Lloyd Sit's records. Black Sit's death was suicide, bruises or not. This letter Sit's a relic, stirring trouble for no reason." Miss Marple Sit's needles clicked softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "And yet, Doctor, you've been keen to study those records. And Mr. Pye, your cloak mended recently, I hear, and smelling of must. Curious, given the shadow Sit's description." Pye sputtered. "My cloak? I mended it for the fête. A costume, nothing more. You steer accusing me based on gossip." "Not accusing," Miss Marple said mildly. "Observing. Peter heard you and Dr. Hayward discuss old debts at the pub, and Miss Cram saw you near the mill, Mr. Pye, while you, Doctor, were digging by the river. The shadow's hands are cold, slick, perhaps with a liniment like one used for rheumatism. Your research into herbs, Doctor, is most interesting." Hayward Sit's smile was tight. "Research, not villainy. Miss Marple, Steph ordered gloves for cold nights, not to play ghost, and digging. Soil samples for river pollution, public health, you know." Craddock Sit's eyes narrowed. "Soil samples don't explain footprints matching those at every incident, or the vial we found. Bitter, herbal, care to explain." Hayward Sit's composure faltered. But before he could reply, Mrs. Finch gasped. "The footprints! I saw them again last night, outside my window, and I heard that whisper again. Sixtus, Supplin, someone wants this letter." Peter spoke up, his voice shaky. "I saw the shadow Sit's cloak. I swear, It was bulky, like it hid something, papers maybe, and the smell, like old clothes. Mr. Clement stirred, his voice weak. The parish book. It mentioned a witness to Black Sept's death, a labourer who vanished. If he saw murder, this letter could spark questions. Perhaps someone fears exposure. The room crackled with suspicion, eyes darting between Pye and Heywood. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice sharp. One of you knows more than you said, saying, Pye, your family lost everything to Black. Heywood, you sit new but digging into old secrets. Who sits the shadow? Pye rounded on her. How dare you? My grandfather suffered. Black ruined us. If anyone sits stirring trouble, it sits that doctor, poking into things that don't sit concern him. Heywood sits eyes flashed. And you sit her innocent, Pye, hoarding mill deeds, muttering about justice. I sit them trying to understand this village, not haunt it. The argument escalated, voices rising, until Craddock slammed his notebook on the table. Enough. We cert not here to bicker. Someone sins using Black Sen's legend to scare or silence. If you Seps got those papers, Pye, produce them. Heywood, explain your nighttime wanderings, or I Sep'll haul you both in. Miss Marple's voice cut through, soft but commanding. Gentlemen, consider this. The shadow strikes in fog, near places tied to Black. Mill, churchyard, river. The letter suggests murder, not suicide. If someone believes their family was wronged, or fears exposure, they might use fear to flush out the truth, or bury it. I recall a case in Little Worthing, where a man staged hauntings to scare heirs from a disputed estate. The method was simple: chilled gloves, a musty cloak, and whispers to fuel panic. All eyes turned to her, the room silent save for the crackle of the fire. Pye's face was ashen, Heywood's jaw tight. Mrs. Finch clutched the letter. Peter shifted nervously, and Mr. Clement's eyes were fixed on the floor. Craddock seized the moment. Right. I sits searching Pye Sip's cottage and the surgery tomorrow, and we sit setting a trap. Mrs. Bantry, you sit till walk the river path at dusk, with my men hidden. If the shadow bites, we sit till catch them. Mrs. Bantry sits eyes gleamed. A trap? I sits blame game, Inspector. Jane, you sit'll help plan it. Of course, Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm. But we must watch everyone tonight. The shadow knows we stir closing in. As the meeting broke up, Miss Marple lingered, observing. Pye left in a huff, Heywood with forced calm. Peter whispered to Craddock about hearing keys jingling in the shadow's cloak, another clue matching Miss Price's account. Mrs. Finch tucked the letter away, promising to lock it in her safe. Clement murmured a prayer, his hands trembling. Outside, the storm broke, rain lashing the windows. Miss Marple walked home with Mrs. Bantry, her mind racing. The confrontation had shaken the tree, and something had fallen, suspicion thick and heavy, on Pye and Heywood. The letter, the footprints, the vial, all pointed to a human hand, cloaked in Black's legend. But the motive, revenge, greed, or justice, remained elusive. As thunder rumbled, she felt the storm gathering, not just in the sky but in St. and Mary Mead's heart, where secrets were about to burst like rain clouds. Chapter 13. Unveiling the Shadow. The rain had ceased by late afternoon, leaving St. Mary Mead sodden and glistening under a sky bruised with clouds. The village seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable as word of Inspector Craddock's trap spread among those in the know. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for adventure, had agreed to walk the river path at dusk, a tempting target for the shadow with cold hands. Hidden in the reeds and behind the old oak, Craddock's men waited, their presence a closely guarded secret. Miss Jane Marple, however, had chosen to observe from a different vantage, her cottage window where she could see the path's edge and the figures moving in the gathering gloom. Her knitting lay idle, her notebook open filled with jotted clues, the button, the cloth scrap, the oily herbal scent, the stolen parish book, and the damning letter accusing forgery and murder in Josiah Black's death. Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of connections, each thread carefully woven. The Shadow's 5 incidents: Mrs. Finch, Peter Grimsby, Miss Price, Mrs. Wicks, and now Mr. Clement's violent attack, formed a pattern, not random but calculated, tied to the mill, the churchyard, and the river. The letter, with its accusations against the Pye and Grimsby families, suggested a motive rooted in the past, revenge perhaps, or a bid to reclaim lost inheritance. The slick, cold hands, the musty cloak, the whispered justice, all pointed to a human hand cloaked in Black's legend to sow fear. But who? Mr. Pye, with his family's grudge and mended cloak, Dr. Hayward, with his late-night digging and herbal knowledge, or another, hiding in the village's quiet corners. As dusk deepened, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught movement, a figure hurrying along the lane toward the river path. It was Miss Cram, the dressmaker, clutching her lurid novel, her face pale but determined. Miss Marple frowned, sensing an unexpected twist. She slipped on her shawl and stepped outside, moving silently toward the path, her umbrella a pretext for her presence. The air was damp, the ground soft, perfect for trapping footprints. At the river's edge, Mrs. Bantry walked briskly, her scarf a bright splash against the twilight. She glanced around, feigning nervousness, though Miss Marple knew her friend relished the role. Hidden in the shadows, Craddock's men waited, their breath held. Miss Marple paused near a willow, her eyes scanning the reeds. A rustle, faint but deliberate, came from the direction of the old oak. Her heart quickened, but she remained still, a silent observer. Suddenly, a cry split the air. Mrs. Bantry stumbled, clutching her arm, as a cloaked figure loomed from the fog that had begun to creep back. "Cold hands!" she shouted, her voice carrying. Craddock's men sprang forward, lanterns flashing, but the figure was swift, darting toward the woods. A chase ensued, boots splashing in the mud, shouts echoing. Miss Marple, unnoticed, moved closer, her eyes catching a glint near the oak, a dropped object, small and metallic. She retrieved it, a key, old and tarnished, with a faint herbal scent clinging to it. The chase ended abruptly. The figure vanishing into the dense trees, Craddock returned, breathless, his men empty-handed. Mrs. Bantry, unharmed but shaken, joined them, her eyes wide. It was real Jane, cold hands, slick as ice, grabbing my wrist. I heard a whisper, justice, and that creak, like leather. But I saw something, a scarf, I think, under the cloak, with a pattern like Miss Cram's needlework. Miss Marple's mind raced. Halt! Miss Cram, here moments ago, now gone. The key, the scarf, new threads in the tapestry. "Inspector," she said, holding up the key. "This was dropped by the oak. It smells of herbs, like the vial you found. And Mrs. Bantry's scarf. Miss Cram's work is distinctive, with those floral stitches." Craddock's jaw tightened. "Miss Cram. She sit's been feeding us gossip," pointing at Pye and Hayward. "A distraction?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly. or an accomplice, unaware of her role. I recall a case in Devon where a seamstress unwittingly supplied disguises for a thief, her patterns betraying him. We must speak to her. They hurried to Miss Cram's cottage, finding it dark but the door ajar. Inside, the dressmaker sat hunched over her sewing, her face ashen. "Miss Marple!" "Inspector!" she gasped, clutching her novel. I couldn't stay away. I saw the trap from the lane, but I swear I didn't do anything. Craddock's voice was stern. A cloaked figure attacked Mrs. Bantry, and she saw a scarf like yours. Care to explain? Miss Cramster's hands trembled. A scarf? I sold one to Dr. Haywood last week, for his sister, he said, and Mr. Pye borrowed another for the fete costume. I didn't think. I mean, my scarves are common. Miss Marple City's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "And your presence tonight, my dear? You were near the river path, watching. Have you seen the shadow before?" Miss Cramist's eyes filled with tears. "Only once near the mill, a week ago. I thought it was a ghost, but it dropped something. A paper, crumpled. I kept it, thinking it was nothing." She fumbled in a drawer, producing a torn note. It read, "The truth lies with the drowned. Find the key." Craddock seized the note, his eyes narrowing. "This key?" He held up the one Miss Marple had found. Miss Cram nodded, trembling. "I don't know. I was scared to tell. It stucks like my novels, but real." Miss Marple's mind clicked. The key, perhaps to a lockbox holding Black's true will or evidence of murder. The scarf, the note, the herbal scent, all circling Haywood and Pye, yet Miss Cram's fear seemed genuine. "Inspector," she said, "the shadow is unveiling itself, piece by piece. The key suggests a goal, documents perhaps, hidden since Black's death. The churchyard, the mill, the river, all places he knew. We must search where the shadow flees, the woods by the river." Craddock organized a search, calling his men to comb the woods at dawn. Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts racing. The trap had failed to catch the shadow, but it had revealed truths: the key, the scarf, the note, Haywood's gloves, Pye's cloak, Miss Cram's scarves, all props in a carefully staged drama. But the motive, justice for Black's murder, or greed for his lost fortune, remained just out of reach. As she sat by the fire, examining the key, Miss Marple recalled a case in her youth where a key unlocked a hidden safe, exposing a murderer's confession. The shadow was human, driven by a past wrong, using fear to manipulate. Haywood's research, Pye's grudge, Miss Cram's unwitting aid, each played a role. But the whisper of justice echoed loudest, hinting at a descendant of Black's nephew, or someone claiming his cause. The storm had passed, but another was brewing. Miss Marple's net was closing, the partial truths aligning like stars in a constellation. Tomorrow's search would bring answers or danger. In St. Mary Mead, the shadow was running out of fog to hide in, and Miss Marple's quiet gaze was piercing its veil. Chapter 14. The Final Twist. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a hesitant light, the clouds parting to reveal a pale sun that did little to warm the damp air. The woods by the river path, where the shadow had fled after Mrs. Bantry's staged walk, were alive with Inspector Craddock's men, their boots crunching through wet leaves as they searched for traces of the cloaked figure. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the woods, her umbrella planted in the muddy ground, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Her notebook tucked in her knitting bag, brimmed with clues, the button, the cloth scrap, the tarnished key, the oily herbal scent and the note. The truth lies with the drowned. Find the key. The trap had failed to catch the shadow, but it had left a trail, and Miss Marple was ready to follow it to its end. Inspector Craddock approached, his face etched with determination. "Miss Marple, we found something, a lockbox buried near the oak. Its stet's old, rusted, but matches that key you found. My men are digging it up now. Any guesses what sits inside?" Miss Marple's expression was serene, but her mind raced. "A lockbox, you say? Perhaps papers, Josiah Black's true will, or evidence of his murder. The shadow's been circling places tied to his death. The mill, the churchyard, the river. This box may hold the truth they've been seeking or hiding." Mrs. Bantry, who had insisted on joining, despite the early hour, shivered beside her. "Jane, this is it, isn't it? The shadow sips motive. Those papers? By ship's grudge, Haywood sips digging, Miss Cram sticks scarves, I sips dizzy with suspects." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Patience, Dolly. The truth is like a dropped stitch. It seems small, but pull it, and the whole pattern unravels. We must watch closely when that box is opened." As the men unearthed the lockbox, a small iron-bound chest crusted with earth, Craddock summoned the key players to the vicarage for a second confrontation. Mrs. Finch arrived, clutching the damning letter from Black's nephew. Mr. Pye, summoned from the post office, was sullen, his spectacles fogged. Dr. Haywood, called from the surgery, maintained his polished calm, though his eyes betrayed unease. Miss Cram, tearful and clutching her novel, hovered at the edge. Peter Grimsby, pale but resolute, stood by Mr. Clement, whose bandaged head was a stark reminder of the shadow's violence. Craddock held up the key, its tarnish gleaming in the lamplight. "This was dropped last night, near the oak where Mrs. Bantry was attacked. It fits a lockbox we've just found, buried by the river. Before we open it, I want answers. Mr. Pye, your cloak matches the shadow's description, musty mended. Dr. Haywood, you've been digging near the mill and studying Black's death. Miss Cram, your scarves keep turning up. Someone here is the shadow, or knows who is." Pyestet's face reddened. "This is outrageous. My cloak sits for the fete, nothing more. My family was ruined by Black, not the other way round. If anyone sits stirring trouble, it sits Haywood, sniffing around old records." Haywood's voice was sharp. "I steps researching village health, not playing ghost. Those papers Pye hoards, deeds, debts, they step public record. He stets the one obsessed with the past." Miss Cram sobbed. "I only sold scarves. I didn't know they be used like this. I saw the shadow once, I swear, but I thought it was a spirit." Miss Marple's voice cut through, soft but commanding. "Let's consider the facts. 5 incidents, all in fog, all tied to Josiah Black's death. Mill, churchyard, river. Cold hands, slick with an herbal liniment, perhaps nightshade-based, to mimic death's touch. A cloak, a scarf, a whisper of justice. The letter accuses Pye and Grimsby's ancestors of forgery and murder. The lockbox may hold proof, but the shadow's goal isn't just fear, it's this box and what it hides." She held up the button and cloth scrap. "These were found near Blackset's grave and the vicarage garden. The cloth smells of herbs, like the vial and key. Someone has been careless, leaving a trail. and Peter heard keys jingling, perhaps to this very lockbox. Peter nodded, his voice trembling. I heard it, and that smell, bitter, like medicine. Mrs. Finch clutched her letter. It's my fault, isn't it? Finding that letter stirred this up. Someone stuts after it, or the box. Craddock unlocked the box, revealing a bundle of papers, a will, signed by Josiah Black, leaving the mill to his nephew Thomas, a letter detailing bruises on Black's body, witnessed by a labourer, and a deed transferring the mill to Grimsby's ancestor after a contested auction. Proof, Craddock said. Black was murdered, the will forged. But who's behind the shadow? Miss Marple Sipser's eyes swept the room, settling on Mr. Clement, who had been silent, his hands clasped tightly. Vicar, she said gently. You been quiet. You found the missing parish book, didn't you? Before your attack, and you recognized the labourer Sip's name, your own grandfather perhaps. The room froze. Mr. Clementest's face drained of colour, his hands trembling. Miss Marple, how did you know? She continued, her voice steady. Your grandfather was the labourer who vanished after Black's death. He saw the murder, didn't he? And fled, fearing for his life. You found his journal in the parish records, confessing he saw Grimsby and Pye's ancestors push Black into the mill pond. You used the shadow, Black's cloak, chilled gloves with nightshade liniment to scare those connected to the crime, Mrs. Finch who owns the mill, Peter, a Grimsby, Miss Price and Mrs. Wicks, tied to the old families. You whispered justice to stir guilt, hoping to find this lockbox to prove the truth. Clement's shoulders sagged, his voice a whisper. I wanted justice for Black, for my grandfather. He lived in shame, hiding in Devon, never speaking out. I found his journal last month, then the letter confirmed it. I used Dr. Lloyd's old liniment recipe, nightshade, cooled to mimic Black's touch. The cloak was my grandfather's, kept in the vicarage attic. I meant no harm, only to scare them into confessing. Pye gasped. You? A man of God, terrifying us. Haywood Sit's eyes narrowed. You stole my gloves, didn't you, to frame me? Clement nodded, tears falling. I borrowed them, and Miss Cremenset's scarf. Sorry. I lost myself in the cause. Miss Marple Sip's voice was kind but firm. Justice, Mr. Clement, mustn't become vengeance. Your grandfather Sip's silence was his choice, but yours caused pain. The truth is out now. The lockbox proves it. Craddock stepped forward, his face grim. Vicar, you still come with me. Assault and harassment are serious, even with good intentions. As Clement was led away, Mrs. Bantry whispered to Miss Marple, Jane, you are a marvel, but how did you guess? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human nature, Dolly. The vicar Set's worry. His access to records, his quiet guilt, it mirrored a case in my youth where a curate staged hauntings to right a wrong. The clues, the button, the key, the liniment pointed to someone close, not a stranger. The room dispersed, the storm breaking in more ways than one. The shadow was unveiled, not a ghost but a man driven by a buried scandal, his cold hands, a plea for justice, gone astray. Miss Marple walked home, the village settling into uneasy quiet, the truth a bitter but necessary light. Chapter 15. Resolution in the Morning Light. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a gentle glow on the village's thatched roofs and dew-kissed gardens. And the fog that had cloaked the village for weeks had lifted at last, as if the revelation of the shadow's identity had cleared the air itself. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting needles clicking softly, a cup of tea steaming beside her. The events of the previous night, the confrontation at the vicarage, Mr. Clement's confession, the rusted lockbox with its damning papers, had settled like dust after a storm. The shadow with cold hands was no ghost, but a man driven by a decades-old wrong, his quest for justice twisted into a campaign of fear. The village was abuzz with the news, though the gossip was softer now, tinged with pity rather than panic. Inspector Craddock had taken Mr. Clement into custody, but with a promise of leniency. His intent, after all, had been to right a wrong, not to harm. The lockbox's contents, Josiah Black's true will, a letter detailing his murder, and a deed exposing the forgery by Grimsby and Pye's ancestors, had been handed to the county authorities. The mill, it seemed, would pass to a distant black relative, found living quietly in Devon, unaware of the legacy until now. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Cherry ushered in Mrs. Bantry, her face a mix of relief and indignation. "Jane, I still can't believe it. The vicar, of all people, playing ghost with chilled gloves and an old cloak. It's like something out of one of Raymond's novels, only real." Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea. Human nature, Dolly, is often stranger than fiction. Mr. Clement's grandfather carried a heavy secret, witnessing Black's murder and fleeing in fear. That guilt passed down, and when Clement found the journal and the letter, he saw a chance to set things right. But fear, I find, can cloud even the kindest hearts. Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea, her eyes wide. "But how did you know it was him? I was so sure it was Pye with his grudge, or Hayward with his sneaky digging." Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice gentle but precise. "It was the little things, as always. The button in the vicarage garden. Its fabric matched the cloak Clement's grandfather left in the attic. The herbal scent slick on the hands, nightshade liniment, from Dr. Lloyd's old recipe, kept in the vicarage for Mrs. Clement's rheumatism. And his worry, Dolly, those shadowed eyes, not just for the parish, but for his own actions. I recalled a curate in my youth who staged a haunting to expose a thief, and the pattern fit." Mrs. Bantry shook her head, marvelling. "You sit her a wonder, Jane. But poor Clement, what sit'll happen to him?" "Inspector Craddock is a fair man," Miss Marple replied. "Clement's assault on himself was more clumsy than cruel, and the others were unharmed, only frightened. I suspect a fine, perhaps a leave from duties. The village will forgive him. St. Mary Mead has a long memory, but a soft heart." As Mrs. Bantry prattled on about the church fete now postponed, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the other players. Mr. Pye, chastened, had admitted his family's role in spreading lies about Black, though he denied the murder. Dr. Hayward, cleared of suspicion, had confessed to digging for historical records, hoping to write a paper on rural scandals, ambition not malice. Miss Cram's scarves and gossip had been unwitting aids, her imagination fueling the village's fear. Peter Grimsby, shaken but brave, had promised to help his family make amends for their ancestors' greed. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, her steps slow but purposeful. The unconsecrated plot, where Josiah Black lay, was quieter now. The brambles trimmed by the sexton, she stood by the weathered stone, reflecting on the frailty of human motives, greed, guilt, the quest for justice. Black's murder, hidden for decades, had rippled through generations, stirring a shadow that was no ghost, but a man's desperate act. She thought of her nephew Raymond, who often said truth was the best disinfectant. Here it had cleansed the village, though not without pain. At the vicarage, Mr. Clement's replacement, a jovial young curate from a neighbouring parish, was settling in, and the fête was rescheduled for brighter days. Mrs. Finch, relieved to be free of the mill's curse, had donated the letters to the Historical Society, closing a chapter. The village was returning to its rhythm, the baker's oven puffing, the post office humming, the river murmuring its secrets to no one. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed. The shadow with cold hands was gone, its mystery unravelled by small clues and sharp observation. She smiled faintly, thinking of the village's resilience, its ability to heal from old wounds. Human nature, she mused, was like her knitting, full of knots and tangles, but with patience a pattern emerged, clear and whole. And so, dear reader, the mystery of the shadow with cold hands comes to a close, its secrets laid bare in the morning light of St. Mary Mead. What did you think of Mr. Clement's desperate bid for justice? Were you surprised by the twist, or did you spot the clues in the village's whispers? Share your thoughts below, and let us know how Miss Marple's sleuthing struck you. Perhaps you've unravelled a mystery of your own. Stay tuned for more tales of intrigue, where the smallest stitch can unravel the grandest scheme.